Take a little breath. This is a heavy little service, isn't it? It's a gray day. It's a heavy service. I hope, though, that you will find some light in it. The summer I was 17, I worked as a groundskeeper in a large cemetery in Nashville, Tennessee, where I grew up, called Woodlawn Memorial Park. 185 acres with no stones, only flat brass plaques and bronze urns for plastic flowers and American flags. No blacks, no Jews, certainly no Muslims or Hindus, and maybe Catholics weren't welcome either. I saw more than one floral arrangement with a cheap plastic phone tacked to a styrofoam rectangle emblazoned with carnations and gold lettering that read, "Jesus called." My desire to work there probably arose in part from my fascination with the 1970 cult film Harold and Maude I'd seen a couple of years before, and the death of my older brother I adored when I was 13. I kept wishing for a young death as a way to peer into that maw of my own untouched grief. But the only funerals I worked that summer were for older folks and an infant. I remember burying a woman in the paupers section of the cemetery, helping to carry her cardboard box to the grave where no one waited or watched. The groundskeepers charged with filling her grave, the only witnesses to her interment. Maybe that moment, as I paused to consider the loneliness of her burial, scarcely acknowledged, I realized that Harold and Maude, in their rather unusual habit of attending the funerals of people they did not know, bore witness in a way that mattered. My brother had no burial service, no funeral, no celebration of life. Because he died in a fiery car crash, my parents elected to have his already burned body cremated in violation of strict Jewish tradition, so that someone in the Reform section of the Jewish cemetery had to turn a blind eye to allow an urn to be interred. My mother insisted that there be no service beyond the family gathering in the rabbi's office for a prayer. We did not sit Shiva for 7 days, and it was not until my later adulthood that I realized that that lack of ritual, even a gathering where people got together and shared stories, left an even bigger hole around that chasm of loss suffered so young. And so it is that I feel such profound gratitude that a couple of weeks ago I got to accompany a young person I love as she consciously chose to end her life after outliving her expected lifespan, foreshortened at birth by a host of medical complications. And every day for more than a week, her family, immediate and extended, gathered in various configurations, chatting at the kitchen table, eating, sometimes playing cards. The smokers, including my friend Elia, would retreat to the garage for a cigarette. The two dogs would mill around, while the cat enjoyed hopping up on the counter every time someone shooed her away. The scene felt prosaic, quotidian, and somewhat surreal. If you didn't know that Elia's organs were beginning to fail, if you missed the morning visit by the hospice nurse, you would not imagine the scene were anything other than a holiday gathering with cousins and aunts and uncles and coffee runs to Dunkin' Donuts. Unless you caught me asking if the casket would be brought in at the beginning of the service or already in place before it began. Death commingles with life because it is a part of life as much as birth. We transition from an existence in utero where we can't imagine life outside the womb, and then we find ourselves transitioning to another experience equally unknown. The liminality of the space I inhabited with this family I love feels sacred precisely because this membrane between life and death is so thin. I'm standing in the kitchen with Hugo as he makes chicken soup for his 34-year-old daughter who will be dead the next week. How can he help but wonder why? What has he done to suffer so? This is his third child who will predecease him. We both know the emptiness that awaits as soon as this kitchen full of family stills, and when his daughter no longer glides in to the counter in her wheelchair reaching for that bowl of soup. I say to him as my own utterance of prayer, maybe the hollow can somehow be hallowed if it is surrounded by love. Truthfully, there is no way to stave off the impending emptiness. There is only the opportunity to accompany it. In the Jewish mystical tradition, there's a story of creation that goes something like this. When the divine energy needs to make room for the world, it has to recede. And a rabbi explained it to me this way. He said, visualize an inflated balloon deflating. And then somehow it bursts into infinite pieces, and sparks of divine light fall everywhere. And the task of creation for humans is to recognize the divine light in every being, to gather it up, to reassemble its constituent parts. Perhaps each of us, not just the collective divine energy, eventually reassembles into a complete being. Now I imagine Eeyore with his busted balloon gathering the pieces into the honey pot. If the purpose of life is to let ourselves be reassembled or reunited with our own divine fragments as we lift up and return the divine fragments of others, then perhaps what happens in death is that once again the divine light within us scatters. It doesn't dissipate so much as disperse. Instead of residing in the body we once had, maybe the light travels with any being we ever touched. The ones who love us, the ones who learn something about themselves by encountering us, even disliking us. The ones we inspire and mentor and raise. The ones we challenge in ways that evoke their growth, cultivate their flexibility or patience or understanding. The ones we extend our compassion to, and the ones who gained the capacity to be compassionate by knowing us. Consider all the beings, not just people, who have touched, who have shaped, who have defined your life. And consider as well your effect on others. Usually we don't have an accurate idea of the scope or the depth of our influence. Perhaps that's why at the calling hours and memorial services we recount the ways that the deceased affected our lives. Imagine, if you will, all the fragments of our essential being, whether it be our sense of humor or our tenacity or our wisdom or our charm or our foibles, our resilience, our suffering, our joy, our need, even our emptiness. Each carried in the vessel of someone else. It's not just a matter of being recalled, it's a matter of becoming part of what imprints another. We tread across sand and the grains shift all the way out to the ocean floor. Perhaps in death our essential energy scatters the way light entering a prism refracts into multiple rainbows, which suggests that the light we leave behind reflects the light we find, the light in others we lift up during our lives, however brief they may be. For all the tribulations and medical challenges that befell my friend Elia, nothing compromised or diminished her light, her radiance, her thoughtfulness. Her generosity of spirit still glows. Maybe you can even see it emanating from me. Each time I was in her company, I could feel my cells absorbing her light, her essential kindness. I remember another young person, much younger actually, whose light I still carry. I met John on the pediatric floor of Maine Medical Center where I did my clinical pastoral education, the hospital chaplaincy program required for ministers in training. John was 7 years old the summer of the year 2000. From the notes in his medical chart, I knew that he was nonverbal, without any medical explanation noted of why. The chart noted that his mother was out of the picture, that his father and 2 older brothers lived 4 hours away. And every day I would visit John, grateful for the chance to hang out without having to worry about words. There was no small talk to make, just quiet playing and the occasional words I offered him. He was quiet even beyond his wordlessness, in his manner. He moved slowly and deliberately, gently. He'd been hospitalized because of an infection around the insulin pump in his abdomen, but most days he appeared not to be in pain. John liked to play at the computer in the patient lounge, and I'll always remember one particular day I found him entranced by the figures on the screen. And I asked if he would be willing to color with me, just for a while, being the low-tech person that I am. And I can still see him registering my request, considering his options to pass the time. In a moment, he lifted his index finger with that dirty little fingernail and pressed the off button. And I had never felt so loved in all my life. And because the universe is benevolent, one of my last days there, I happened on John in his room while a lovely pet therapy volunteer brought out an enormous white bunny. And I sat down on John's bed and stroked the rabbit's soft fur with him. And when the volunteer offered to take our picture, I knew there would have been no way I could have photographed John myself. That would have been a violation, of course, of confidentiality and a breach of my role. But when the volunteer handed us each a Polaroid print, I smiled and silently thanked the universe. I treasured that photo because it allowed me to revisit the time I spent with John, the way he instructed me into how to be present and attentive. He provided an easy way for a nervous novice chaplain to pass the days without having to knock on doors and enter rooms of other patients who were less eager to see a chaplain. Over the years, I wondered what became of him. Several years ago, I went onto Facebook thinking maybe I might find him there, but I only found other folks with the same name. And then for some inexplicable reason, I decided to try again a few years later, around 2011. I went onto Facebook, I typed in his name, and I got a link to his obituary. John died at the age of 8, about 6 months after I last saw him, 23 years ago. I have been carrying his light, thoroughly illumined by the vision of that small finger pressing that computer button. I have held fast to the feeling of the last time I encountered him. I heard him crying from the hallway, and I followed the sound into his room, where a young nurse's aide was brusquely combing his freshly shampooed hair. And suddenly John began to retch, and the newly made bed was instantly soiled. And exasperated, the young aide yanked off the sheets beneath him. So I lifted John and carried him to the couch, and I cradled him as he curled in my lap, his arms tightly wound around me, his head burrowed in my neck. The trust he bestowed in me changed me that August day in a way that enlivens me still. When I speak of the universe holding us, this is what I mean. We are held in body, but also in memory. And whether we recognize it or not, We are held by those who carry us and those we carry, the ones some of you named. We are held by the places we have trod, the tree trunks we have leaned against. We are held in the stories others tell. I do not know the name of the woman I helped bury in an unmarked grave. I know only that she lived a life worth noting. And so did the infant and the older folks that I met in death that summer in the cemetery when I was 17. On the 50th anniversary of my brother's death last year, I asked a friend who sings kirtan music if she would sing to me. I sat in a comfy chair in a devotional space in her home, the sunlight streaming in, and she and her husband singing and playing their instruments. A candle burning next to a small vase of flowers from her garden, and a photo of my brother I had brought. I needed that ritual half a century later to honor a life and a death that shaped me. Sitting in the path of the sun's rays, feeling that music for an hour, filled me. The hollowness is real, but it is not complete. It fills with the light of divine fragments making their way into our breathing bodies. Amen.